Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our final That Escalated Quickly of 2022. This is our fifth installment of the series this year. My name is Charlotte Wilner. I'm Executive Director here at the Trust and Safety Professional Association, or TSPA. As many of you now know, TSPA is a nonprofit. We support the global community of people working in online trust and safety. We work alongside teams to help them build the expertise and the skills and the relationships they need to navigate the trust and safety profession, which is a really unique profession, and it's always a really unique time for this unique profession. In this series, we talk to everyday people who've built a career in trust and safety. Most folks in the field today did not start out thinking, I know what I want to be when I grow up, a trust and safety professional. It's still fairly new as a professionalized field. And so in this series, we talk to people about their career journeys and the choices that they made along the way that ultimately prepared them for where they are today. It's an opportunity to ask them questions about sort of the journey that they've had, their perspective on the field, or, whether they have any new dog tips, as might be the case. We are talking today with two wonderful members from our community. Pia is an advisor to TSPA and is going to be asking questions of Fadzai, who is a longtime member of TSPA. And we're really excited to get the conversation going. You will have a chance to ask questions. We have a Q&A box here on Zoom. You can type your question in, and we'll be leaving some time for those at the end. But in the meantime, Pia, I'm going to turn it over to you as the main question asker.
Thank you, Charlotte. Really appreciate it. Awesome. Hi, Fadzai. Happy Friday.
Hey, hey.
It's really good to be chatting with you today. I know it's the end of the week for you in London. You're probably, wrapping up, getting ready for the holidays. Yeah. And I, the end of the year is really always, for me at least, such a great time for reflection and preparation for the coming year. So I would love to ask you a few questions about your background and your journey into the trust and safety space.
Awesome. And I should say in advance, especially for the people online, I have a new puppy. So if you see me glancing sideways, it's just to make sure he isn't destroying anything. So just in advance.
Yes, the trust and safety of your current physical environment is also very important. Okay, so first of all, what do you do now?
So I'm actually at Salesforce now, which is cloud computing, and I work in the Office of Ethical and Humane Use of Technology. And so what that means is I work on a team that writes policies to make sure that Salesforce technology isn't being used to facilitate or contribute to any harm.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I think, responsible innovation and the broader space is really such an important and interesting part of trust and safety. And it's really, really great to see more companies tackling these issues by investing in these high level roles with, really talented and smart people such as yourself. And we need more of that. So,
yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Perfect. So how did you venture into this space, right? Like, what was your first job in trust and safety?
So and TSPA does this really well in their curriculum. Any job that is keeping people safe online, I would call it a trust and safety role. And so my first job in trust and safety was actually in the Africa public policy team at Meta, which was then Facebook, under Abelo Okobi. And I, at the time, I was working on what content moderation looks like in Africa and claims of under enforcement and why was that happening. And so it was going to different communities and activists and regulators to talk about the Facebook community standards and to encourage in-app reporting. And then I did that for a year and eventually ended up on the content policy team under Monica Bickett, where I started working specifically on writing policies related to content. But definitely the public policy role was my first trust and safety job.
That's really interesting and exciting. So then what was it about that, and sort of when and how did you decide to make this your career?
So I want to really emphasize what Charlotte said earlier about, I don't think I thought it was a career until like 2 years ago. Yeah, I think like literally 2 years ago. I think And I remember when the series that escalated quickly, when that started, I made a joke about how that should probably be the title for my autobiography, if I ever write one day. I think, yeah, about 2 years ago when I was in the content policy team was when I was like, oh, I think this is what I want to be doing. I'm a lawyer by training, and caveat, being a lawyer by training isn't the role by which you get into trust and safety. But I think in terms of background, I've just always been interested in freedom of expression. I did my dissertation on protest in Africa as a form of expression. And when I got to Meta, was working on that from an African perspective. And then by the time I got into the content policy team and I was leading the hate speech team, I think I kind of turned around one day and I was like, hey, I kind of really enjoy doing this. And I'm good at it. And so maybe I just want to keep doing it. And that's when I realized, I'm like, oh, I wonder what this looks like going forward. And I think that's why spaces like TSPA are so important, right? Because I think 2-3 years ago, we didn't even have words for what we were doing. We were just like working at tech companies. And now we can actually say like, oh, I have a career. I am part of a professionals association. Like this is a thing. There are other people in this field as well. So I think it was about 2 years ago when I was like, oh, I think this is what I want to do for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I think so many people are drawn to this area for that very sort of concept of that balance of, online safety and freedom of expression, and figuring out how does that work, right? And
Right.
so, disclaimer, I'm also a lawyer by training. Again, you do not need to be a lawyer to be in this field.
No.
It just happens that, I just think there's a lot of us in this space who just end up working in these like legal adjacent roles, right?
We just really like hard questions is what it is.
Yeah, exactly. And well, also because you kind of end up get to think about policy, and there's
Right.
advocacy elements, and there's
Right.
regulations, right? So it's really interesting to see all of that work in a different context, and I think we get to utilize our skill sets quite a bit, and so many different types of work. This is for sort of anyone who's interested in getting the field. I think so many different types of work are applicable to this type of work. And so like for me, I started out my career at the Department of Homeland Security working on this issue, balancing the very critical interests of national security against the fundamental rights that we have here in the US on like civil rights and civil liberties. So it's just that now it's transferred to the online versus the physical landscape. And so that's why I think so many of these skills that folks have are transferable. So so you don't have to be a lawyer, but it can help.
Like real emphasis on that. But yeah, I think and I also think the reason why there's so many lawyers in the field is because when you've had a chance to practice, there's often a lot of frustration in practice that you're sort of like, hey, I think I want to end up on the policy side of this, and I'm really eager to have impact. And like, what is more impactful than being able to work on online issues? So that could also, I mean, I also just think lawyers just tend to drift out of practice. One way.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah, but speaking of that frustration, right? I mean, that's not to say that trust and safety is an easy field by any means, right? There's a very common perception in our field that it is extremely difficult work. So what do you do to navigate that difficulty, and like what keeps you working in trust and safety?
Yeah. So whenever someone tells me like, wow, that sounds really hard, I always go, yes, it is. Because I'm like, there's no reason for me to tell anyone that it's easy. And I think it's difficult, but I think that's because it's nuanced. So yes, honey. Okay. Sorry, that's the puppy. I think it's because the field is nuanced, and the questions that we're trying to answer, like no one's even, it's not just that we're trying to answer them, no one's even asked these questions before. And now we're trying to find what are the right questions to even be asking, and then what are the answers that make sense. So we're literally building the plane as it flies, which I think is incredibly exciting. There are jurisdictions in the world that have been debating hate speech legislation for decades, and now we're trying to do it in real time across borders. Like that's mind blowing. And so I've really enjoyed that aspect of it. In terms of then what keeps me in it, it's like reminding myself of why I'm doing it. I think I tell people that if you're going to work in trust and safety, you have to be an optimist a little bit. And I know that sounds really weird, like given all the bad content that we have to engage with and that we see. And so it sounds counterintuitive. But I think if you don't believe in people being good online and using online spaces for good, you wouldn't want to preserve that goodness. My mom used to sell her the goods from her farm from over WhatsApp. I have cousins I haven't seen in over a decade that I'm connected to via Facebook. I have found Black communities on TikTok and on Twitter and on Instagram when I first left home. And so if I believe in the goodness of those spaces, I'm like, oh, then I want to work in preserving that goodness and I want to keep the harm away from them. So that keeps me in it, I think. So I do think you have to be, which anyone who knows me will tell you, I'm the last person to call myself an optimist. But I do think you have to be a little bit of a tech optimist to be working in trust and safety.
I totally agree with you. I've had conversations with so many fatalists, and it's so funny because I'm like, but we're not reversing course now. We're not changing.
Right,
We're not
exactly.
changing. So if not us, then who?
Right.
And we have to have that mentality, I think, to work in this field totally. And the challenges are unprecedented. They're global. So it's very exciting work, in addition to being difficult. And by the way, that expression, it's a very common expression in our field that we're building the plane as we're flying it, which it makes me laugh because like it should terrify any normal human to be like, yes, this plane that we're supposed to be flying in, it's not really built quite yet. We're working on it. But it's so true that is it's completely novel challenges, and we're doing all this for the first time. And so yeah, I totally agree that that's sort of what keeps many of us in the field. So tell me a little bit more about how you explain your job to your family and friends, because I know that my friends are always confused about what I do. Like, I always think of that episode of Friends where no one can explain Chandler's job. And it's like, how do you describe your work?
And I remember, because when we talk about this question, I laughed so hard. My parents have no clue what I do, bless them. My mom tells people at church she's a lawyer at a tech company, which I'm like, it's not untrue. And it's easy to explain to the other church people. Yeah. So we leave it at that.
Yes, I am a lawyer and I work at a tech company.
And at a tech company, yeah. As to whether I do law at that tech company is a different conversation, but that is what I do. And so I'm like, close enough. With my friends, like at a broad level, I tend to just say I work in a job that makes being online safer. And I think everyone can kind of engage with that, and they're like, okay, cool. Like then this sounds like you're trying to do good work. And so I keep it there. And then generally my friends and family are just supportive. Like whatever it is that I'm doing, they're like, this is great, and they kind of keep it going.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty succinct explanation. I mean, at this point, unfortunately, I think every single person who has been online has had an experience where potentially they have felt unsafe. And so online safety is something that is, understandable to the vast majority of people, I think. So great, elevator pitch way to to describe it.
Very unintentional. Very
So what, we were talking about how you don't have to come from a particular background to work in trust and safety, which I think is one of the really unique things about our field is literally you can come from almost any background. So what skills or lessons from your life have come to bear on your work, maybe perhaps in like unexpected ways?
I'm going to, and I know we keep reiterating, like you really don't have to be a lawyer. But my education, I think, both in the classroom but outside it, I think probably comes up quite a bit. I mean, trust and safety is new, right? But it's operating in systems that have existed for centuries. So no well-intentioned trust and safety practitioner can write a policy that to stop racism or to stop sexism or to stop white, like no one can do that. But you can write policies that make sure that your platform doesn't entrench those systems even further. And then in order then to do that, that means then you've got to have a good understanding of the system that you're engaging with and the frameworks in which people have talked about those systems. And there's just so much literature that's out there, whether it's equality law literature, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's human rights literature, and so on. Like academics and activists, especially from Black communities, from queer communities, who have talked for decades about what these systems are and what they look like. I often do turn to those to try and remind myself of like, oh, this is what it means to try and write equitable policies. And I think that sometimes we forget because trust and safety is so new and these platforms are new, we tend to feel like, oh, what I need to write needs to come from scratch. But I'm like, well, we're not writing in a vacuum. And so reminding ourselves of the context is something that I tend to go back to a lot. And you and I, we spoke about this. This is not to over-index on identity, but I think being a Black African woman working in these spaces often means that I spend a lot of time trying to correct assumptions when I'm in certain rooms. I think just the nature of some of the freedom of expression and speech conversations are very, very US centric. And then as an anti-colonialist, I'm like, hey, I'm pro-voice, but that's not the same as being like pro-hate, for example. And when you come from an African state that has talked about liberation movements, that's just something that's important.
Your puppy agrees.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, those things tend to come up a lot in terms of my work.
Yeah. And let's talk about perspectives, because I think this is one of the most fundamentally overlooked issues in our space, that, our space is quite homogenous, although it is getting better.
Right.
And one of the most critical elements to making the internet safer for everyone is to have everyone represented, right? So that means people of all backgrounds and all regions in the world being in these rooms where the conversations are happening, where these decisions are being made. Because as you alluded to, we all have different lived experiences that inform the way in which we walk through this world, and including the specific experiences that we have online, right? So those that don't share those experiences have blind spots when it comes to decision making, which we all will have blind spots to a certain degree, because we don't share all of our lived experiences given our identities, right? But many of the people that are in those rooms making those decisions aren't even aware of their blind spots, right? And so
exactly.
So yeah. So how would you say your particular background informs the work and the impact that you've had?
So it's interesting, right? Because whenever when someone raises an argument about like, hey, we need to have more voices in the room, the first piece of feedback you get is like, oh, scale. It's not possible to have every single identity recognized. And I don't think that's what we're saying. I think and that goes back to even engaging with those frameworks of existing systems. I think I've committed myself to being the person in the room to raise concerns of people who aren't in the room. And that's not to speak for them, but to just raise the questions about like, hey, have we thought about this? Like, have we engaged with this group? I think, and it's incredibly frustrating, right? And so when sometimes we'll have a conversation and I'm like, hey, actually, do we know what the impact of this will be in West Africa or in Southeast Asia? And like, hey, thanks for raising that. Do we know what this impact will be on queer communities? And queer communities are not homogenous. Like, they're very different if you're in Southern Africa as compared to when you're in the US. Have we thought about that? And I think it's the importance of recognizing just the disproportionate impact of some of the decisions we make and who they impact, that are not just not in the room, but they're the people who are most often will be the ones to use those tools because they sit outside the US, because they're marginalized communities. And so I think I call myself an agitator. I'm like, before we do anything, here are all the questions that I have.
Yeah. And I love that word, and I love that concept, or, a similar thing is like making good trouble, right? So I think that's so important, because it's also in the best interest of, the tech companies and the online service providers, because if you want a wider range of people using your services and continually using them, you want those perspectives in the room. So it's really a win-win for everyone.
I think so as well. And sorry, go on.
No, please.
It's a win-win, but it's also just the right thing to do. And I
guess
think
I'm used to like trying to convince the business. So it's like
right,
you
exactly.
have to use
Sorry,
that.
you're
Yeah,
right.
but
Exactly.
it is, at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So okay. So let's talk a little bit about leadership. You are the director. At a director level at one of the world's largest tech companies, which is really impressive. Was it your goal to get into leadership, and if so, how did you work towards that goal?
So absolutely not. If you ask all of my former managers, I think I resisted many leadership opportunities when they were offered to me. Because I was like, oh, I'm not going to be good at this. I don't have any like big ideas that are going to change policy or the world. And so I was just like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be in a leadership position. But I think once I became a leader, I was really interested in like, oh, a good leader is someone who just makes sure the people under them can still do good work. And I just spent a lot of time, like I had the privilege of people managing like brilliant people who were working on violence and terrorism and bullying and hate. And I was just like, okay, how do I make sure that I'm not in the way and that I'm making sure that they can do good work? And I got such satisfaction from that. Anyway, all this to say, like, was not my goal. But if anyone does have that in their heads about like, hey, I don't know if I'll be good at it, or I don't know if I have anything new, then the thing to say to yourself is like, actually, as long as I think that I care about people and their work, maybe I could be a good leader.
Absolutely. And I want to kind of touch on the point that you first made, was that you were like, oh, I don't have any major ideas or ideas that will change the world. And I would obviously disagree with that, but I also would disagree with that because I would ask myself, and we should all ask ourselves, well, what makes people think that they do have those ideas? Like, there's certain people who are right. Like there are certain people who are brought up in our society to, and they're hailed as, oh, I've got all the world changing ideas. So why don't we think we have those? Right. Why not? Why not us?
Gosh, that's a really good point. And do you want to be in my lap? Is that what's happening? Is that what's happening? Okay. Sorry, guys. He was meant to be asleep and he slept for all of 10 minutes and now he has all the energy in the world. I'm going to put you down. Oh, okay. Gosh. Yeah? Sorry, give me 2 seconds.
Yes, no worries. We're just taking a puppy intermission, everyone.
I am so sorry. Okay, that should keep him. So I think, so your point about like, oh, people who are hailed as having good ideas, I think it's also what we term being good or grand ideas. I think because I thought leadership was about the big ideas, I then devalued what empathy and care looked like in a leader. And I think now, whenever I tell like the biggest thing I hear from people who are like, oh, I'm not sure if I should be a people manager. I think like I care too much about people, and so I don't know if I could be objective. Then I'm always looking at them, I'm like, but you should care about the people you are reporting to you. Like that is the most intimate relationship your report has at work, is with you. And it makes us uncomfortable when we hear the word intimate and at work. But I'm like, guys, I talk to my manager more than I talk to some of my friends. So it is an incredibly intimate relationship. So I want my manager to care about me. And that is a skill, that is a good thing. And so I think, to your point, I think the people who are often like, oh, I don't have a good skill or a good idea for what it looks like to be a leader, it's often because we've devalued the things that are like, oh, this actually does make you a good leader, that you care, that you empathize, that you want to invest, that you want to think about management and not the work. And I think that's probably been the best leaders I've ever had are people who cared about me as a person and in my career, and people that I still go to for mentorship and for advice. because I know that they cared about me long before like anything to do with the KPIs in their team. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think in hindsight, I think in my head, I was like, I don't have work project ideas, but I'm like, actually, I do care about the people I report into me. I care about them deeply and I want them to do well. And I think that's what makes for good leaders. And I think especially in trust and safety, the work that we're doing it's hard and it's sensitive and it's close to home. And I've had many instances where it's like, hey, I'm working on content from Southern Africa. I'm working on content from my country. You need to know that you can turn on to your manager and know that, oh, they care about me. And so if I need to take a step back, if I need a personal day, if I need a moment to breathe, they're going to jump in and defend me there.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And I think that's even more necessary in our field as you're talking about, because we are exposed to some of the worst, you know,
Right.
online, and we see things, and you know, that are visually, you know, kind of, they leave imprints on your mind. They're hard to sort of get out of your mind. But also, I mean, even on a personal level, when one or more of your identities is attacked, even if it's not directed towards you specifically or personally, it still takes a toll. And so that, I think that's an even greater reason why you need that level of empathy and understanding as a leader in our field specifically.
Right. Again, TSPA, because they're thinking about resilience as well. Because when you're doing work that you know impacts so many other people, I think the people that I found to have been most selfless are people who work in trust and safety. Like they're the ones who burn themselves on both sides of the candle trying to get this right. And I think a lot of that is because we just didn't talk as much about resilience and self-care at the because again we weren't even clear this was a profession. This was just something we were doing. I think over time, as this field grows, we're going to get a lot better at that. And I'm really excited for people being able to enter the field and know they're being held from day one. But yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, and I think going back to one of our earlier conversations about like, if not us, then who? I think sometimes we have that mentality of like, we need to work tirelessly to prevent that feeling that we're feeling from being experienced by others, right? We want to mitigate the abuse. We want to minimize the exposure and extent of this terrible content. And then we just, you're right, we sort of burn ourselves out. So it's interesting, but obviously that's not to say that is, you know, the entirety of our work. And there are some really, really great and positive elements and benefits to working in our field. And at the end of the day, it is very satisfying work for many of us. And so for those, you know, that are watching this and that are interested in learning about trust and safety and getting into the field, what advice would you give to those people who are thinking about entering trust and safety?
He wants to be picked up again. What's happening? What's going on?
What's your puppy's name, by the way? Since he's making such a...
I know he's making such an appearance. The son of a bitch. Oh, I'm not supposed to swear. Sorry, Charlotte. Sorry. We should censor that before we post that. So his name is Zua, which is Shona for the sun.
Wow,
he is
that's beautiful.
10 weeks old today. And I spent an hour tiring him out right before this, and he was asleep for all of 10 minutes. And he's going to fall asleep right when this is over. I can already say that.
That's just how it goes. Yeah.
It's just how it goes. So to those who are thinking about getting into the field, I think I would say, like, trust and safety is all about transferable skills. You don't ever have to have worked in tech or in safety or in anything to that effect to work in this field. If you know anything about comms, you know anything about government affairs, you know anything about regulation, anything at all, you can work in trust and safety. I think if you're invested in wanting people to be safe online, then you can do wonderful things. I would also say, like, once you're in there, don't assume you have to stick to one area. I have friends who worked in ops who now work in policy, and friends who worked in the law enforcement area now working in communications. Like, it's all about being able to, it's all about transferable skills. And we do need as many people working in the space as possible. Like, we've talked about the importance of different perspectives and having as many different voices in the room. So I would say, like, anyone who's even vaguely interested to just get into it and figure out from there.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, companies are investing so much into trust and safety now. They're really realizing how important it is. It's sort of like what cybersecurity was maybe 20 years ago, what privacy started to become, 5 to 10 years ago. It's trust and safety is really having its moment now. So we need all the people we can get. And what advice would you give to yourself if you were first starting
out? So if I could go back, being particularly A-type, I think I would go back and tell myself, like, it doesn't have to be perfect. I think I was so conscious of, oh, this is really important work, and I need to get it right because it impacts so many people. And so often I was immobilized before I could do anything. And I think if I could go back, I would be like, hey, actually, you're going to make mistakes, and this doesn't have to be perfect. Trust and safety is about incremental and rational progress, and not like instant getting it right. And so I probably would go back and give myself a little bit more grace, to be honest.
Love that. I think we could all use that advice. Not even just that you're first starting out. Every day I need to be reminded of that.
Right, exactly. I literally, I have that on a sticky note, like on my computer, of just like, hey, you will make mistakes. And my career coach has to say that to me all the time. I think the type of people who get into this work are people who want the world to be better. And so we want to get it right. And I think we could do more of asking each other or reminding each other often, like, hey, it's okay that this isn't perfect. And if it's okay that actually this is probably only 20% of the solution, and you'll figure out the other 20 over the next year and the other 50 over that, and you've done the best you can with what you have in front of you, we'd probably all be in a better place.
Yeah. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I totally agree.
And
it's so connected to what you were saying earlier about the space being so new. We're all, like, literally all of us are figuring this out as we go. So I agree. Don't be so hard on yourself. Again, need to tell myself and remind myself of that. It's definitely one of those you give advice that you don't yourself follow, right?
Exactly that.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about this like transition about, from the fourth to the fifth industrial revolution and how that space is going to be governed, right? It's not easy work, and, there's not really any precedent for this work. So we're all doing the best that we can with, with what we have and what we know. So totally 100% agree with you there. Okay, wonderful. Well, I think we have potentially some audience Q&A. So let's take a look.
And thank you for your patience with my not tired puppy.
I feel like what you need is
I was like, oh my gosh, I literally ran around the house with you for an hour. Like, why are you not asleep?
Did the sound just get crackly for anyone else, or was that just me?
Yeah, it got crackly.
Okay,
I
was
now
like,
it's gone.
No.
Oh, yeah. Wait, did it get crackly?
No,
is the dog chewing on something? We're gonna find out. But yes, we do have. It's still making a crackle.
All right, let me take the.
Hang on. Yeah, now it's good. But can we hear you? Oh, yeah. It's a headphones thing. It always is. Yeah. Okay. Let's make sure we can hear you. Okay. Oh no, now we can't hear you.
But you probably have to, go into your system preferences, change the sound.
Well, you're doing that. This is so classic, folks. This is it. Like, we do have two questions in the chat for now. One is about just advice for folks who maybe have a recent law school experience. And the next one is sort of looking into 2023. So maybe, Pia, since you also have this law background, maybe we could actually start with that first question. This person says, thank you so much for this program. Do you have advice for a recent law school graduate with translatable work or internship experience who wants to break into a trust and safety role like investigations, privacy, policy roles? And then they say, it's funny you guys are both lawyers because I wish law school career centers talked about this kind of career trajectory more. So what are, I think actually for both of you, what are your thoughts on sort of those questions?
Fadzai, do you want to? Oh.
I'm sure glad we got to at least the stage of the program before being.
Okay, so I can try and sort of jump in there. Well, first of all, I think it's interesting that law schools aren't really talking about this because it is such you know, a really great an applicable field to go into, and you know, all of these tech companies that work in the space need lawyers. So even if you, I mean, either you're practicing law or not, right? If you want to do something law adjacent, if you want to do policy or privacy and investigations as well, it's I mean, I would say like just apply, honestly. Like so many of these roles, like we were saying earlier, do not require extensive experience. And if you already honestly have a legal, like if you have a law degree, you are already sort of equipped in a way to start working on policy issues and doing investigations and even the privacy, you know, issues. A lot of the analysis that's required to do this work is very, I think, complementary to your legal education and utilizes a lot of those skills. So I would honestly just start applying to jobs, even like, you know, just fresh out of school. I think that you will find that you really will probably will get a lot of, I think, offers. I mean, obviously the job market isn't like the greatest right now, but in general, I think having that law background really helps. And then the other thing is more just general advice. At least this is kind of worked for me, is just like follow what your interest is. Like don't think about it like, oh, you know, for me, it was like, I need to practice law. No, I just kind of followed what seemed interesting to me. And then once I had done that for a bit, I got this sort of call to do something else. And I would just sort of follow that gut instinct to do something. And that's my background has been completely non-traditional. I've worked in government. You know, I've worked now at tech companies for several years. And so like, you know, and then coming from law school, like that, none of this is very traditional. And I think most people have a non-traditional background in this field. So
yeah, there is no traditional background.
There is no traditional
that's what's actually very cool about this moment.
Yeah.
I'm hoping, is that any better?
Sounds great. You're doing great.
Oh, okay.
Problem solving on the fly. Another thing you have to do as a trust and safety professional.
Well, I mean, given that I still say it's a lie, I work in tech, given I'm still confused whenever I use Zoom. So I wanna plus one the part about like traditional backgrounds. I do think probably early on, maybe in trust and safety, there was like this idea of like, oh, if you're a lawyer, you're better suited to writing policy. And I was always like, that sounds terrible. I don't want to be in a room full of lawyers doing this work. I really, really don't. And I'm saying that as a lawyer. So yeah, I definitely want to plus one Pia's point, like pick the thing that you're like, I'm interested in working in this area. And that also might change over time and come across over time and become more clear. Working in the field, like working on what I work on now, was definitely more an over time movement. So yeah, just pick and just go in and then figure it out from there, which yeah, it sounds like terrible advice, but I promise it works well. I would also say if you're still thinking about it, and I don't know if everyone who's listening to this is a member of TSPA, but please do join and talk to other people and ask about like what it's like and whether there's internships or whether there's opportunities to shadow people or go to events and getting a better idea of like what you're interested in as well.
I mean, thank you so much, Fadzai, for saying so. But that actually starts to answer one of the other questions we do have in the chat, which is, folks are interested in joining, but also they know that there have been layoffs in tech. And so, like, what advice do you have for people who do have these ambitious career goals, who really want to be in this space, but who also want to set pragmatic expectations around market conditions? I would say something you absolutely can do while there's sort of this uncertainty in the market is continue to get to know people in the work, right? And continue to do work that, if not directly in the field, is, adjacent and relevant. And it turns out, I mean, I was hearing from the two of you today, there's a lot of work out there that is incredibly relevant and adjacent to trust and safety. Will ultimately prepare you for that ultimate career in trust and safety. Would either of you have anything to add to sort of like, vibes are weird right now in tech?
Not really. But just kind of adding on to that point about like joining TSPA. I mean, the reason that I'm like sitting here talking to you all is because I looked at TSPA and I was like, this looks like an interesting, organization. Let me reach out and let me become a member. And then I started going to the events and just networking and meeting people and just learning more about, the industry as a whole. So it's like, it's kind of back to that point about follow what your interests are. If you're interested, like pursue it and figure out how to just, be curious, learn as much as you can. And, I mean, the market conditions, they'll pass. Like this is, like we said, tech companies aren't going anywhere. This, our industry isn't going anywhere. People are going to need, folks doing these jobs. So that's just what I would add.
And I would also follow up with, trust and safety doesn't need you to be doing this work in a tech company, right? Like regulators are constantly, God knows, regulators are hiring aggressively to figure out how to regulate in this space. So also just keep that in mind. Like, I do think it's really important to think about it as trust and safety as like how to keep people safe online. And that's going to show up in multiple companies and not just the companies that create and run the platforms.
Totally. Academia, think tanks, 100%.
We have time for just one more question, I think, and I'm going to combine 3 questions into one, which a few folks are asking about the future, sort of 2023 and beyond. What do you see as, some of maybe the most interesting or the most, difficult challenges that we're facing as an industry? And one person in particular says, what types of questions or challenges do you think the industry should be tackling together? What's sort of your perspective on that?
I mean, I'm biased, and I think anyone who's in the TSPA Slack channel knows. But like regulation. Oh my goodness. And I think there's such an opportunity for like cross-company collaboration in a way that I don't know that's always been very clear before. That I just think regulation is going to force us to have to be. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's the point. I think if we're committed to a safer internet, we do all need to get into one room and talk about how we want to do that. So yeah, I think anyone who's talked to me from TSPA knows the first thing on my mouth is like Digital Services Act, Online Safety Act, and Online Commerce Bill, and just on and on and on. So that's what I think from a challenges perspective, and also just opportunities for collaboration. Pia, any thoughts? No?
Sure. I can just add, like, yes, that is a very regulation is a very tangible sort of issue that we're all facing in this industry. And I think, but the broader sort of perspective on that is like, why are we, facing these regulations? And it's because of the challenges of what we're seeing online is that, the threat landscape is constantly evolving, and bad actors are finding new ways to, be abusive, and the polarization in society is just making, fomenting so much more, hateful content online. And so keeping up with all of that is, I think, such a challenge. And, regulations want to just impose these heavy restrictions on us to, like, curb and curtail all of this, but that's not realistic. Just in terms of then how we want to be able to use the technology, it's really going to limit the use of the technology and stifle innovation, right? And so going back to that balance, question again, is like, I think that is really the challenge, is finding that balance between those two.
Yeah.
And so, and I know we're at time, but I just think like a follow-up to that is, I do think the way bad actors have evolved is also a reason for more collaboration across companies. Seeing some of the NCII work has also been incredibly interesting. And I wonder, like, oh, what are opportunities for us to do this more than just in this area or this space, and how do we convert that to partnerships beyond just tech companies, but with like safety organizations and with schools and so on and so forth. I think that's incredibly exciting. And for me, obviously biased, but also thinking across the stack, like how do we make sure that's not just happening top of the stack? Like how do we do this across the internet stack, and how do we have realistic conversations about that as well? Yeah.
Well,
very exciting year.
Like, what a year. Looking forward to it. So thank you both so much for your time here, especially at the end of, heck of a year. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for sharing your dogs. And thank you for being part of the community. We just want to say thank you as well to everyone who joined us live today or who's watching online later. As I mentioned at the top, this is a series put out by the Trust and Safety Professional Association, TSPA. We're a nonprofit that supports trust and safety professionals. And so if you are interested in becoming a trust and safety professional yourself, if you are already a trust and safety professional and you're like, this is content I would like more of, right? We would love to have you in the community because it's folks like Pia and Fadzai and a lot of other lovely folks. So with that, all our best wishes for a healthy and safe and happy remainder of the year. We hope to see a bunch of you again in January. And in the meantime, stay safe out there. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Charlotte.
You.
Bye.